Oh, hey, didn't hear you start the podcast. Welcome to the first podcast of 2021, the year where everything's going to go back to normal. As we've seen so far this month, everything is just fine because calendar year 2020 ended, and everything is peachy. Before we get to the first guest on this first podcast of the new year, I want to tell you about our friends, our sponsor. Yes, they're still around for the new year, Il Taco Foods. Il Taco Food has been feeding the hungry people of Chicago since 1927. That's 94 years ago. 94 years ago. Yes. Their most popular item, the Pizza Puff, became a Chicago staple almost as soon as it hit the very first hot dog stand here in the Windy City. For those of you that don't know, a Pizza Puff is premium mozzarella, crumbled Italian sausage, and a signature homestyle sauce wrapped in a pillowy yet crispy crust. And that's just the original. They have 14 different flavors. You can learn more about the flavors and where to buy them from their website, www.iltaco.com. Through 4 generations of hard work and a passion for good food, their family-run business now distributes Chicago's Pizza Puff in 38 states across the U.S. Check out the website to find out where you can get the good stuff. Again, that's www.iltaco.com. See, I'm rusty. We're all rusty. All getting back in the swing of things. Today is January 14th. So still, the year's still fresh, even though it feels like it's been quite some time, especially because of events that happened earlier this month. And on the podcast today, to talk a little bit about that, among other things, as part of a film he's working on, is Jason Rink. Jason Rink is a filmmaker who's actually working on 2 different films right now on similar topics. One of the films is The Steal, a documentary that follows the Stop the Steal movement of supporters of Donald Trump who thought the election was stolen. He's been following it since pretty much the election ended, but then was in Washington, D.C. on January 6th when all the shit kind of hit the fan. For lack of any other term that I could use. But he's also working on a second film, which he just released the trailer for, too. The Buffalo Man, the story of the QAnon shaman, who the Buffalo Man is the person you've seen. He was at the January 6th riots at the Capitol, and he's been at other events with crowds like this. But beyond just like the nonsense of that day, which Jason and I get into and talk about since he was there, he talks about really how he first got the idea for pursuing these films, why he wanted to cover this movement, and the curiosity that he had and he says it in this interview, is he wanted people to come away from watching this with wanting to ask questions about how we got here, be more productive about it. Why did this movement exist? Why were they skeptical of the election? And the fact that he went into it with an open mind, I think is productive. I went into our conversation with an open mind about trying to learn more about this. And I hope if you go see this movie, which you can find more about at thesteal.com, if Facebook still lets me post this video, because I know anything with Stop the is being removed from Facebook. So maybe I'll put seal noises over it when I put this in post-production to avoid any problem. I hope you go into the movie with an open mind. Again, it's thesteal.com. It'll be out soon. And The Buffalo Man is the other film. Both should be really compelling documentaries. So here he is, Jason Rink.
Ladies and gentlemen, Joe Kaiser.
No! God, please, no! 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 No!
I went out to eat for the sake of this next joke. Joke.
For the deviled cheese and sausage.
Joe Kaiser, ladies and gentlemen.
I want to start with something that kind of caught my attention, is the fact that you started this film I mean, like, where did you get the idea, or when did you get the idea to start following this movement? Because it's only 2 months old.
Yeah. So, back in 2007 and 2008, I was involved in Ron Paul's campaign and saw that develop into the Tea Party movement out of that. And so I tracked that pretty well. I was involved in that for a while, and just saw some things happen in that sort of populist uprising there. And so when I started paying more attention to the MAGA movement leading up to the election, there was aspects of it that started to feel that way for me. I started digging below the surface a little bit about what was going on there, and realized it was more complex than a lot of people were giving it credit for. And so when the election happened, right after that, I started seeing some things pop into my Twitter feed, about, these rallies that were starting to get planned, for election integrity. People saying, hey, this election was stolen. All that, those are the type of things that people were saying out there. And I was like, that's interesting. What's going on? And so there was a big rally that I think it was like the second Saturday after the election, that was going to happen in DC. And so I don't know what the date of it was, but it was like the 12th or 13th or something like that after the election. And I was going to go out and check it out, and I was like, I couldn't make it. And so what ended up happening was, after that day, I just pulled some footage from online, and I just cut like a little promo trailer sort of for this organization, Stop the Steal. I was like, well, I wanted to get on the radar of this guy, Ali Alexander, who is in charge of it. So, I don't have much of a Twitter following, but I just kind of cut a video, posted on Twitter, tagged him. And the next thing I know, he DM'd me, and he's like, hey man, thanks. And I was like, well, I have a production company. We're kind of interested in what's going on. Maybe we can connect with you guys and make some content. And then, I don't know, I think it was just a few days later, maybe a week later, me and my filmmaking partner, we found ourselves, we decided to go to Georgia for a state house rally that was happening there. And I reached out to them again and said, hey, like, we're coming with a documentary crew. Anyway, we can get some access, yada, yada. And they were like, yeah, well, let's meet. Let's have, talk a little bit. And so what came out of that meeting, and that was like just a couple of weeks after the election, was that they would give us, access to, sort of follow them. And they were really spearheading the movement, but there was all of these associated organizations too. There was this really interesting organization called Walk Away, which this guy Brandon Straka started, which was a bunch of like Democrats who were supporting Trump, and there was just these interesting characters. And then you had these other characters like Alex Jones, right? And you had like Nick Fuentes, and it's like, okay, this is a really crazy mix. And then Tea Party patriots, and like Women for Trump, and so it was really an interesting hodgepodge that we started to see forming. And so what I ended up doing was we just started to say, hey, let's just see where the story goes. Like, there's something here on the populist movement. There's something here about the election. Like, is there really evidence of election fraud? Is this just some crazy conspiracy theory? And so that's really how it started. And what ended up happening is we just ended up spending almost the last 8-9 weeks on the road, capturing things all the way up through the January 6th event in Washington, D.C.
Did you understand? So, I mean, you said that you noticed similarities with the MAGA movement to the Ron Paul populism 2007, 2008. And I totally get that. And I've heard that argument a lot. And there are a lot of similarities there. And I think when people dissected more of the Trump phenomenon in like 2017, people started to dig more beyond the surface of what people thought this was all about. But with stuff like Stop the Steal and these claims about election fraud, when you first started noticing it, did you kind of understand where they were coming from? Or is this a case of, we really need to dig more into this, talk to these people more? Because it seems kind of like an abstract idea. Like, what election fraud are you talking about?
Yeah. So I would say that all through 2020, excuse me, starting really with COVID and seeing some of the things that were going on in the media coverage, and then some of the social media censorship that came out of like wanting to make sure alternative perspectives weren't getting out there, right? Once that started to happen, and I had been watching over Trump's presidency, how I just really felt like the media was against him, big Hollywood was against him, big tech was against him. I felt like it started to really ramp up. I felt like all these cultural forces that are on the side of the left, I started to see that as a more dangerous manifestation of power rising up against our liberties than I saw as a threat on the right, which was all I was hearing about. So all I was hearing about was how bad the right was and Trump and fascist and all this thing. In the meantime, over here, I saw the left, and they've got the access to all the platforms and to shut people down and entertainment and, academia. And I'm like, that to me seems more dangerous if I just had to look at how far it can go, right? And so that's when I started to really, I guess, have like what I would say is like sympathy for like
Sure.
Trump. Like in a weird way, Trump started to feel like the underdog to me. It was like he wasn't power, speaking truth to power. Like he was the underdog in the situation, right? And like COVID was getting laid at his feet. And again, I'm not out here defending Trump necessarily for anything that he might have done wrong. All I was just noticing was this sort of narrative playing out and feeling like, man, there's a group of people here who are supporting him. And I started to have a sense that he was actually going to overperform his numbers from last time. And I was like, that'd be really amazing if he got more votes. Like, what would that say? And so I just started to recognize that there was sort of a group of people that he represented that felt beat down and like they weren't getting a fair shake and they weren't being heard. And, it was really this type of thing where it was like, hey, we're supposed to be able to get like redress of grievances with our government, and it's like, you're supposed to be able to get remedy. And so, I don't know, I just started to sense that. And so when the election integrity thing started happening, I started asking myself two questions. Number one, was there anything different about this election than there was previous elections? So, a lot of times people say, well, there's never been evidence of widespread voter fraud, to shift an election and everything. And it's fine. Let's say that that's true. Okay. The question is in the year of COVID, did certain things get implemented that actually really weakened the integrity of the process that we haven't seen before? So that was one question that I started to dig into. The second question I started to dig into was around this narrative of Trump being sort of Hitler fascist guy, like Orange Man bad. And I started saying to myself, if his second term is really like the next term of, Hitler, or the next term of the worst guy ever, the fascist guy, like it would almost be morally righteous to do anything you could to prevent him from becoming president. So those two questions just sort of stuck in my mind, I guess. I was like, I want to go into this open-minded, not saying how other elections have been, but given sort of the cultural narrative around Trump as the scapegoat and the enemy of all things, and given this whole COVID situation, which has opened the door to a lot of different things in voting, like, was that like a perfect storm that would allow malfeasance to happen and go almost unnoticed? And that was the question that drove me into it. And then as I pursued that question, just meeting the people, researching, like I was really just saturated for the last 10 weeks on all of the different things, watching hearings that happen, Rudy Giuliani's hair dye running down his head, and, like all of the, Lynn Wood and Sidney Powell released the Kraken and QAnon, and like all of this perfect storm of crazy things and reasonable things. And, then this organization that I saw move in a powerful way to actually go from being totally dismissed to where they had over 100 representatives and like a dozen senators that were ready to oppose the election results in Congress. Like that's crazy that happened in 8 weeks. And so that was the journey for me. And a lot of it, we were really saying like, we don't know where this is going. Like, is it possible that this can get like overturned for like, is it possible that there's a thing that, the Pence card and like this and that, like, we were like, let's see where it goes. And so we found out kind of where it went on the 6th, right? Like,
I think even just as a relatively neutral observer who wasn't making a film about it, I had those moments too, where it's like, it seems ridiculous, but actually, could he have a legal argument here? Could this be overturned here? And I think a lot of people who, not even neutral, but just maybe were tense about the election, had those moments of like, wait, is there actually something here?
Yeah. And personally, like I even felt like if he did actually have a legitimate legal argument that he was able to get to come out in his favor, I didn't necessarily think that was going to be the best result for the country. You know what I mean? Like,
no.
Like I think a lot of us can imagine how that things might be going right now if Trump would have just been like announced to be president on the 6th, like, so even as this was happening, I was like, even if he's got a case, the social unrest that could come as a result is crazy. And so there was so many different things at play. One thing that I think is really interesting is I think there's a great number of people in the MAGA side of things that really started to learn a lot about activism at the state level and state legislatures. And I think that's a really, really good thing. I think that there's a lot of people who have come to the place to recognize that, in fact, these positions in local and state government that nobody pays that much attention to, like the Secretary of State or the state House representatives or whatever, actually have a lot of power and influence around preserving election integrity and how elections are carried out and the certification of electors. And, as somebody who's really more of a guy, like I'm a libertarian at heart, and I'm into federalism, and I'm into however much power can be closest to the people is the best, I think that is something that I've seen as a big win out of all of this is a lot of people getting educated about how this stuff really works. Many people have this sort of fantasy that like we have the popular vote here, or they think the Electoral College is this like grave mistake the founders made, like that thing kind of sucks. And it's like, man, there's a lot of reasons for the safeguards and the processes put in place that elections are run at state level according to state constitutions, and that only state legislatures can change those things, and that changing the laws and rules around of elections aren't super easy. They're not supposed to be done by executive fiat. And then when you get into some of these legal arguments that happen in like Texas, when Texas like sued the other states in that lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court and they didn't hear it, that was all based on this idea that like, hey, we're a compact of states and we're choosing the leader of all of us. And so in order to do that, we need to make sure that every state follows its own rules, because if they don't, then they're sort of defrauding us of our, they're diluting our votes because they're not sticking to the rules of the game. And so, it was really easy, I think, for many people in the public and in the media to sort of write these things off, rather than it could have been a really awesome opportunity for the American people to really learn how this stuff works and be like, hey, listen, here's why the state of Texas actually kind of has a point here, right? Yeah, the Supreme Court's not going to listen to it, but here's what they're saying. This is why state constitutions are important. This is why. So there was an opportunity for it to be a national civics class that I think a lot of people didn't take.
Sure. Do you think the focus on those state battles and like the process of certification could end up having an adverse effect? Because I was thinking about this with like impeachment, because I remember when Bush was leaving office in 2008, you heard people on the left saying, I hope Obama tries Bush and Cheney for war crimes. And then when Obama was leaving office, or excuse me, when Trump beat Clinton, it's like, is he going to charge Hillary Clinton? Is Clinton going to go to jail? Now the whole argument is Trump going to go to jail? And my fear is it's just going to become a reaction now if Democrats lose an election in 2024 or whenever, that can we battle this out in the states? Can we battle out the certification process? And maybe that's overblown, but I always wonder, like, what are the adverse effects of this in the next election?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you get to a good point, which is sort of like the cumulative effect of political division that's occurred. Like, because we're sort of in this place now where it's like almost every side wants to try to see if they can throw the last administration in jail, right?
Yes.
And it's like, the other thing too is, I don't want to go off on a rabbit trail, but I find myself thinking, like, who the heck would even want to run for the presidency other than the worst people in the world now? Because
Totally.
It's like your life is going to get ruined. You could potentially be thrown in prison afterwards. Like, even if maybe like on trumped up charges or whatever. And I'm not saying there aren't actual charges or whatever that could be present or whatever for this administration or others. I'm just saying, like, it just seems like a politicized battle now to like punish your enemies, right? And to be victorious, and then shove the nose of the opposition in their own crap. It's like, and I think it's really bad for the country. I think it's really bad because what we really want is we want statesmen and women to rise up who have integrity and who want to do the right thing. And it's like, it's so costly. It's so costly to put yourself out there like that in the climate that we have. And so I think part of what you're getting to is, like, what are the negative implications of elections always having to be, lawfare happening now whenever an election happens. Yeah. And I think, frankly, like, I don't see it going away, because we're getting more and more politically divided in many ways. I mean, Trump got 73 or 74 million votes, like 12 million more votes than he got 4 years ago. And when you think about the media coverage and like the administration that he had, like almost impeached, COVID, whatever, it's like, that's kind of miraculous. And then when you think about Biden, assuming all the vote totals are accurate, by the way, that Biden could actually not campaign, basically stay away the entire time and get 80 million votes. Like, it changes a lot about, like, there's just a lot there, man. It's like, wow, we just have a divided nation. And so I think we have questions before us that are like, do people really want unity and healing? Is there compromise possible? Is 330 million people too many people to govern under one central government? Like, I mean, questions and conversations that I'd love to see happen in a really open way in the public sphere, because it's all about, how do we live in peace? Like, how can we not try to legislate our own preferences over each other? So
I think a lot of what you're getting at is what you said before, of this feeling from a lot of people in the Trump camp of all these cultural institutions being against them. I think that's probably the most interesting thing about all of this, and what your film is following, is that feeling. And that's something I sympathize with. You mentioned before about that sympathy you got for Trump, as I get the sympathy for his followers who are really committed. The thing I sympathize with is this feeling that Hollywood and politicians and all these institutions are against you. And I think I'd love to get your take on this, is Stop the Steal a lot about that, just this feeling of everything against us. So of course the election's rigged, of course the deck is stacked against us. Or when you were talking to people, do you think they actually understood the factors that you laid out about COVID and the election being abnormal, so maybe this is rigged? Or is it just, was a lot of it just this feeling of everybody's against us, and therefore the election is of course rigged?
Well, there's a lot of self-reinforcing biases that come into play with all of this, because, I think any honest person who will look at what we would call mainstream media coverage would recognize it's slanted to the left. Like, we could argue about that, right? But I think there's pretty good ways to show that is the case when what we would classify as that. And that, but if you don't think that's true, you need to recognize that the people that I'm talking about absolutely believe it. And, when Fox News called Arizona early, right, in the election, like I was at these rallies, these are Republican Trump MAGA people, and they would start chanting Fox News sucks, right?
Yeah.
Fox News is like dead to them now. And it's
I know,
so
it's wild.
and what's happened is it's pushed everybody into this other silos of news, alternative news, like Newsmax, OANN, the National Pulse, like Revolver.news, Steve Bannon's War Room, like all of these things. And by the way, like people don't recognize that, like, Steve Bannon's War Room. I mean, I listened to it this entire time because that was where you were getting a lot of what was going on. It's getting like 30 million downloads. It's like one of the biggest podcasts in the country, period. And like people don't recognize it because if you don't even know, a lot of people don't know it exists. And they don't know that the people that are getting out into the streets, rallying, getting behind Trump, that are, fight for Trump and stop the steal and all of that, they're listening to all of those sources. They're not really going to the other sources because they don't trust them. They think that it's fake news. It's like what Trump says. And I tend to agree with them that, if I'm going to be totally honest here. And yet, like, it's not necessarily great for us to only get our information from sources that confirm our biases. That's true across the board. So, that process, is happening when you have things happening now too, where, a couple of the people that I was following, and I consider a lot of these people my friends, like we spent a lot of time on the road with them, and are getting deplatformed, on a number of places, and seeing things happen like the government trying to say that because these people organized, constitutional protests, they now should be tried for like insurrection charges. Like I think that's totally out of hand. And I'm going to sit here and say the people that were leading in leadership of Stop the Steal, like that, there's no way that that's even accurate. Like that's a political, witch hunt, and,
Yeah.
and I'll defend all of those people like about it because I understand really what they were doing and what was happening. And, the media narrative about what happened on the 6th even is just really, really bad right now. And so I guess my point is that, it's the combination of being, like I said, going through the last 10 weeks of trying to get these cases heard by different courts, having them thrown out on issues of standing or all these other things, the Supreme Court not hearing it, feeling like you don't have any remedy available to you, because really none of the cases actually got to a place of discovery beyond some of these state level hearings. Then you had some states in like Arizona where subpoenas were issued for the actual voter data, and the elections board refused to honor a subpoena. You had things like, so there's things that happen in states that are questionable legality, that you're like, wait, what's happening here? Why is the stonewalling? Why? And how that feeds back into a narrative of like, hey, if there's nothing to hide, then why are you trying to hide it? If the media is being honest, why are they, not reporting the stories? And so that's, I think I just see that whole mechanism tends to just reinforce people in our own biases. It's creating more of a divide. And I did a podcast the other day where I said, listen, like, I think there was definitely a powder keg brewing, but I think the media kind of lit the match on it. And I don't think the media will be held accountable for it. Like, because there's been some gaslighting going on, and I'm prepared to say that that's true. And I'm going to say that the people that I've been hanging out with for the last 8 to 10 weeks absolutely believe it. And so once you get to a place where you're like, hey, we have no remedy, here we are, we're in DC, there's the Capitol, maybe we should take our maybe we should take our grievances directly to the people who have something to do with it. And so I think the events of the 6th are more complicated, involves context that I think goes back more than just the last 8 to 10 weeks. And we just look for simple answers. People look for simple answers like Trump said something that made people go there, or who set up this rally. It's like all that stuff was permitted. The Capitol Police were aware of what was going on. There's a lot of questions we should have about why you could have a session of Congress and Senate with the vice president present and people could actually get into the Capitol that easily. Like, there's a lot of questions around that. So I think a lot of things came together on the 6th that have been building for a while. And I think there's an opportunity for us as Americans to ask the right questions about it that can all get us to a place where we can say, hey, how can we solve this? How can we come together and listen to each other rather than double down on what I think has been going on for the last 4 years, probably longer than that. It was going on in the Obama administration.
Right.
It's been going on for a while. So.
Yeah, I think that's the right remedy to this, and what should have been the right remedy after the 2016 election is to ask questions about how we got here instead of just being frustrated and divided about it. I'm kind of mixed about like the events of the 6th in general. I have this like internal conflict where, because I share that sympathy with a lot of people in that movement who just feel the distrust that led up to that day, but ultimately it's more frustration and the feeling of things getting worse, the way Trump treated it and the way he talked about it. So it's kind of like two things existing at once in my head of I wish he changed his rhetoric before and after and during on that day, so it didn't lead to what happened. Then also sympathizing with the distrust that you just mentioned of everything that led up to that day for years and years and years.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I will say that, I was there at the Capitol. One thing I can say is that the breach in the barricade at the Capitol, that happened long before Trump was even done with his speech. I was over at Trump's speech, like for the first 10 or 15 minutes of him talking. And then I walked over to the Capitol because there was a permitted stage that the Stop the Steal organization had set up on the backside of the Capitol, because they were just going to have speakers there. And that's where they were hoping people were going to go, right? So there was people going to go over to the Capitol, but there was a stage where, with a couple of speakers. It wasn't huge, but it was permitted, all of that. And that's where they were hoping that people were going to go. Well, what happened is I went over early to kind of help my videographer get that set up. And so I got to the Capitol right when people started gathering there. There was thousands of people starting to flow in there already, and there was hundreds of thousands over by where Trump was, my estimation. I mean, it was multiple Ohio State stadiums of people is my guess, being an old Buckeye. And so, I saw the people sort of jump over the fence, push it over, saw that there was very few security out front, and recognized quickly, like, oh, the Capitol steps are going to get flooded. Like, I knew that was going to happen. And, and I will say that, like, I think for the most part, it was like Trump supporters, MAGA people. Like, I think anytime you get a big group of people together, you're going to have like infiltrators. You're going to have people who, are up to no good. And I think that the people who, kind of went first, they were the people least interested in Trump's speech because they weren't over there. You had to wait hours to get into that speech. You had to wait hours to get a space. People started lining up at 6 a.m. And so I think you had a lot of the more agitated types, the more fringe type people who were over there potentially. And I definitely think, there was confrontations, and that wasn't a good thing. And I know that people like Alex Jones and Ali Alexander, like, I've got video of them saying, like, guys, don't do this. Let's go over here. Yeah. Like trying to redirect what was the energy, but it was just too many people. It was just too many people. So you had madness of crowd stuff going on. And what was interesting was everybody kind of was allowed to hang out all over the Capitol outside, like on the balconies, scaffolding and everything for a couple hours. Wasn't for a couple of hours probably that the riot police started moving in, surrounding it, and deciding to just try to disperse everybody. So that was sort of, what I found interesting too was why it kind of went that way. How come were the Capitol Police just overwhelmed by people? I did hear word that there was some word to stand down a little bit because they didn't want negative optics to happen, like has happened through like BLM and stuff like that. So they were like, look, we don't want to put up a fight because that's bad. That looks bad. People can get hurt. So let's just let them in. And so there's a lot of conflicting stuff going around. I don't know the full story, but just a few thoughts and some things I saw.
What was your reaction and what were you doing when things started to get out of hand? What was going through your head?
Well, I shot about 30 seconds worth of video out front because I'm like a filmmaker, right?
Yeah.
And then I was like, I had the moment where I was like, am I going to kind of go there like to try to document stuff, or am I going to like go over here where nothing's happening? And I was like, I'm going to go over here where nothing's happening. So like because I was like, this seems like a bad idea. And I'm like, oh, there's a lot of people with iPhones in there. I'll be able to rip that footage later. So no, I'm always in filmmaker mode, right? I'm in producer mode. But, I wasn't really that worried that anybody was going to get hurt. I mean, I know that happened, but the other thing I knew was that like the security was so strong kind of everywhere else. Like, cause where Trump was speaking, there was like Secret Service. You had to go through all the security to get into where that was happening. And, I don't think there was like armed people, right? Like DC, that's not a good idea. And there was a ton of Secret Service. And so, I just didn't, and when I've seen some of the photos coming out, I was like, a lot of what was going on in there was like pranks. It's like people
stealing the podium and
and so part of me is kind of like, and then the other thought I have is that just a few hours later, Congress was actually able to reconvene and do business.
I know, it's crazy.
Like, listen, I'm not sitting here being like, making the whole like BLM versus MAGA, but I am saying like over the summer, I saw some of the federal buildings that got occupied and you couldn't do business in them afterwards. You know what I mean? So like, it wasn't even totally vandalized or ransacked. Like there wasn't like, so it was just a different kind of, it was a different kind of protest, I think. I'm just saying it was different, like, than I think some of the things that we've seen previously. And I think that's worth recognizing. Like, I think it's worth recognizing that Congress still could go in there and do business. I saw some video footage of people in the Capitol picking up trash as they were leaving. And I'm like, this is bizarre, so it felt like protest, breach of the Capitol and like Capitol tour all thrown together.
They were walking through the rope lines at one point. There's photos of them walking through rope lines.
Yeah. And there's footage of people clashing violently with cops. And like cops, like I could see being overwhelmed, like looking out, being like, we're outnumbered 1,000 to 1 right now. Like, this is not good odds, and what do you do in that situation? And then, obviously like it's totally tragic, a woman is shot and killed and at least one officer injured and killed as a result of, I think, the conflict. But, like there's a lot of mixed feelings there, but I think overall, like right now, here's what I will say. I think that it was a strategic error by whoever decided to take their grievances up that way, whoever those involved were that like created the breach and moved people in there. It was a strategic error because the heavy hand of government is now activated and public sentiment is against you. And like we've seen in the past, when the state has an opportunity to roll out sort of these types of legislations that curtail our freedoms, our ability to petition our government and gather together, they do it. And I think that that's going to be a bad result. I think it's going to impact you know, the we the people to peacefully assemble and
Yeah.
speak our minds. I think that we're going to see that curtailed, and so I think it's ultimately a loss for liberty and peaceful governance.
Yeah, that's the stupid thing about it, and not even getting to the legal side of it and what government can do, but public sentiment.
Yeah,
You're not convincing anybody when you do something like that. You're not going to bring anybody over to your side, and especially with the context of it, where a lot of people for 4 years who didn't like the president are feeling this tension building and building and building, and they think he's a fascist and all this stuff, and all of a sudden something like that does happen, then it just confirms all of their fears.
Yep.
And then they're okay with the government coming in and then doing whatever they want.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. So yeah, now we're moving into post-production on a film because we've got a lot in the can that we wanted to, and now we're looking to say, what story do we want to tell? And we've got a couple of different stories, and in fact, we've got two totally separate documentaries coming out of this as well. So that's pretty interesting. But we're hoping to take this movie and get it out within the next 6 months. I mean, we would like to get it out very, very soon. Sure. But we also want to spend the time to really make it good. And I think, we're looking to see how we're going to go about getting it distributed and, all those questions. But yeah.
So you're still figuring out the story, but are there any interviews that you had, whether it was that day on the 6th or before then, that stuck out to you as particularly enlightening moments, especially with the premise that you went into filming with?
Yeah, well, we did cover some of it in a more cinema verite style when we were following some of the main organizers, because we spent a lot of time like throwing lavs on them and getting in the back of vehicles with them, or like, spending time at dinners with them. I had a really interesting opportunity where I was at Roger Stone's house and he made us a pasta dinner.
Oh, I saw that in the trailer. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, so it was just funny, it's like Roger Stone is this, and it was before he was pardoned, and he had a shirt on that said, pardon Roger Stone, and, he's a character, and, so that was an interesting experience. We're hoping to get a follow-up with him actually. And, one other person that we interviewed that is just really figures pretty strongly in this guy is a state rep named Vernon Jones, who's out of Georgia, and he's actually a Democrat state rep, but he came out an African-American, and he came out as a Trump supporter. So he's got a really interesting story about him as an African-American Democrat in Georgia supporting Trump and getting behind the Stop the Steal movement. So he's a very interesting character. C.J. Pearson is well known as a young conservative voice. But what's interesting is, C.J., after we interviewed him a couple weeks ago, and then we've been in touch with him because he was getting ready to go to a college, but that college is trying to withdraw their acceptance because of his involvement of this. So you have this, African-American conservative in Alabama who's going to potentially be denied entry to a college because of really holding the wrong opinions. I mean, really? So I think what's interesting is out of the 6, there's some things happening now in this social media deplatforming. And so when I say we're heading into post, it's like, well, the story's still unfolding right now of kind of what's the aftermath of the 6th. So what I would say is, we've had a lot of great interviews. I'm getting ready to interview a guy named Matt Brainerd this week, who was like a guy who crowdfunded like $600,000 to research the voter data, and came up with all of this different stuff. And so there's an interesting story about sort of crowdfunding and crowdsourcing using public data and the internet to try to parse, whether or not there was illegal voting going on. So to me, there's a lot of really interesting things in this story about how some of this information came up, the internet, social media, it's just, there's so many different threads. And I've thought that maybe we would actually turn it into a series, like a docu-series with some shorter episodes. so we'll see. We're going through it now, and we're looking to pull in some additional resources. I've really been funding it entirely on myself and through my company. We do a lot of client work, but put a lot of money into it, and looking to pull more resources and talent in who want to help us do that. But like I said, we're trying to get it out the door pretty quick, and starting to talk to people who are interested in distribution and stuff like that for us. So
yeah, especially while it's top of mind, and like you said, the story's still going, and it's gonna complicate things for you with, or maybe it won't, but it seems like it might, with marketing it on Facebook and everything. I know that was a bit of a hiccup for you, at least recently.
Yeah. Some of the people that we've been with have been completely deplatformed. And then even my filmmaking partner had his Instagram, and he's just like a filmmaker. Like, he had a bunch of stuff about his family on there. And then he had some Stop the Steal posts, and it's like, they shut it down yesterday, and he's got to go through all these hoops to get it. And so, it's like, I think there's a kind of an overreach going on right now. And we could do a whole episode on this whole thing about, tech censorship and, what's going on, and when you start getting into the idea that these tech companies are probably talking back channel to each other, doing some coordinated things, and it seems to be happening not even handedly. There's a lot of hypocrisy that I think you can see in how these measures are applied, which all that does is continue to enrage and get people to double down on what they already think about big tech and big media. So that story's still unfolding. But right now, I think we're trying to thread the needle as being a filmmaking team, trying to tell a story here, more journalism than anything. Is kind of the way I hope that will be seen as, and that it won't close too many doors for us on that end. So
yeah, that's another unintended consequence when people are celebrating that Trump got banned from Twitter, but it's like, okay, what comes next? Yeah. Like, what accounts are going to be deplatformed and everything? And it's just silly because they're going after the key word, I think, Stop the Steal. Like, that's why a filmmaker get in trouble for it. Or if I'm promoting this podcast this week and the post comes down or something, like, it's just it's a whole nother can of worms.
Well, fortunately for you, our domain is just thesteal.com. We don't even have stop in it. So, but that's the website, is thesteal.com. We've just got a sizzle up there and a way for people to sign up and track us. We are still on Twitter, again, I think we're being seen as a more journalistic effort around this. And so far that hasn't been too terrible. It doesn't seem like we've gotten anybody too upset with us. So
that's good, because like you said, you want people to ask questions. Like, you're just trying to tell a story. So it's good they see you that way. Is there Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, anything else you want to?
Yeah. So you can see us at Twitter at The Steal Movie is our handle on Twitter, and then thesteal.com. And we're also at The Steal Movie on Facebook right now. And then I will do a little plug here as well. Just in the process of following a story for 8 or 10 weeks, certain things happen that you don't realize what's actually taking shape. And so, about a month ago, we decided to sit down and interview a guy who we kept running into all over the country. And then, so we sat down, had like a, hour, 45-minute interview with him. And then on the 6th, the Capitol was breached, and my filmmaking partner sends me a text. And he says, "Oh my God, Jake did it." And he sent me the picture of the guy with the buffalo horns, standing there with the face paint, and he's at Mike Pence's desk flexing. And he was the guy we had interviewed like a month ago. And so we immediately just reached out to him and said, "Hey man, will you give us an interview?" And he sat down with us the day after that, and a couple days before he ended up getting taken into custody. So we ended up getting a really, really great, like, exclusive 1 hour with him. And we've decided that we're actually putting out and looking to produce a standalone documentary on this guy, because he's actually not really part of the Stop the Steal, and he's sort of a standalone character. He's atypical Trump supporter. He's not, they're trying to make him sort of represent like the Trump movement. And it's like, anybody with a brain knows, like, no, there's something else going on with this individual.
Sure.
But he's a very surprising person. We're getting ready to launch the trailer, today. So it'll be out by the time this podcast comes out. But I would encourage people to go check out thebuffaloman.com, where we've got a website for that film, which we're actually hoping to get that put out there and picked up actually pretty quickly. So we're actually moving into post-production on that right now. And you might think it's kind of a thin story. It's like, really? Can you do a whole, but we are really getting into the instant memification of people, like how a narrative spins up, because he didn't even realize what was being said on, he doesn't even pay attention to social media originally. So I ran into him on the street. People were confronting him. He was in danger. He didn't even realize what was being said about him. So this film is actually going to be quite entertaining. And it's going to get into some interesting cultural concepts, I think, as well. So anyway, that's the other film I'll promote. Go check out the website. And man, I really appreciate you having me on today and, talking about what's going on, what I'm up to.
Absolutely, Jason. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I don't think it's a thin story just because of that memification. Like, people were so interested in him in general. So I encourage people to definitely check that out. And I'm going to check that out probably today as well. But thank you so much for your time today, Jason. Appreciate it.
Yeah, awesome, man. I appreciate it. Have a good day.